Welcome all. I'm Andrew Harper, the Acting Director of the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House. And I'd like to begin tonight by inviting Auntie Violet Sheridan to do a Welcome to Country.
Thank you. That was quick, caught me off guard. Well, it is my pleasure to be here once again. It's been a while. Well, it's 2 years since we've been all back here together. But it's my pleasure, and the topic is something that I'm very interested in. So I'm looking forward to listening to Judith talk about the big place on the hill and the elections. Sometimes I think, well, some of those people that are up there shouldn't be up there. So my fingers was crossed about some of them, but you can forgive those Queenslanders. So I'd like to thank that light Andrew, and I'd also like to acknowledge Ian Toms, the chair, and I'm looking forward to listening to Judith talk this morning. And I hope you don't mind when at the end of my welcome, I'm going to talk a little bit about the referendum, because it's something really close to my heart as well. We held 2 workshops here in Canberra. If anyone's familiar with Thomas Mayer, Thomas and Tom Calmer, 3 of us did a workshop, one at 10 o'clock and one at 6 o'clock. So I'll talk a little bit about what came out of that. So I believe a welcome to country is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owners of the land welcome you, and it also shows respect for the first peoples of the land you're meeting on. I suppose it's a little bit about not going to someone else's home or house unless you're invited. The reason for this custom is to protect your spirit while you were here. And it also shows, like I said, respect for the First Peoples. I am a proud Ngunnawal woman as I walk into the future with my ancestors, teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, my culture, the Aboriginal culture. So I'd like to acknowledge any First Nations people here this evening, but also like to acknowledge all you non-Indigenous people here as well. In keeping the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure to once again welcome you to the traditional land of the Ngunnawal people. It is my mother's country, and on behalf of my family and the other Ngunnawal families, I say welcome, welcome. And thank you all for having me back again, so I must have been doing something right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the referendum that's coming up, and you've heard our Prime Minister talk about it. What pleased myself as an elder and a lot of elders in the community when he come out and he did his acceptance speech, he fixed the flags and talked a bit about the Hillary statement from the heart. And I know a lot of non-Indigenous people will probably say, well, what do they want to have a voice to Parliament? Because they've already got 12 Aboriginal people up there, but they're not there to talk for us. They're there to talk for their constituents who voted them in there as well. So we want a voice. But if you go back to 1967, when I was about 12-year-old, and then the Australian people voted 90% to include us in the census. And I said to my dad, what is that all about? And he told me it was the state governments used to control our lives as Aboriginal people, but the census included, when we got included in the census, that means the federal government had a say over us as well, which didn't make any difference to what our outcomes. But we're hoping that the referendum that will, and I got a feeling that our Prime Minister will go to the vote next year, because we can't go beyond 2024 because it would used to, you may as well sweep it under the carpet or put it back in the cupboard. But we're asking the non-Indigenous people to walk beside us, not behind us, not in front of us, beside us and support us when this does go to referendum in a yes vote. Because we do need a voice to Parliament. We do need to make changes. I've got 26 grannies, 2 great-grandchildren. If you're familiar with the Aboriginal kingship line, I'm a kingship carer as well. So down the track, I want something different. I am sick to death of us round about the 26th of January. Let's sit down and work things out. Because we're all Australians. I'm an Aboriginal woman, I'm an Ngunnawal woman, but I'm a proud Australian. So we need to sit down and work it out, but we need you to support us when this referendum comes up. The outcome from the workshops we had at University of Canberra, we're going to meet each month as a group. So we're going to people are going to come talk about, learn a lot more, but go back to their workplaces, go back to their communities and let their families know what is the referendum, what is the voice to Parliament, what is the Hillary's statement from the heart. So if you, any in the room, are interested in knowing more about this or being involved and supporting us a lot more, I'm welcome to talk to you more. And if you want to come to our next meeting here in Canberra, you're welcome to come. So that's a little bit about, we need you to support us when this goes to referendum, because it's, as Malcolm Turnbull said, it's very hard to get a referendum. But I'm hoping that Canberra stands out in front like we did with the plebiscite, that we have the most votes to say yes when it does come up to a referendum. So I'm going to stop talking now and let's just get on with the meeting. But I thought I would talk a little bit about that, because we really need black and white to come together and we need you to vote yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Auntie Violet. It's always a pleasure and an honour to have you here at Moed, so yes, you have done something right. I'd also like to welcome Ian Thom, the Chair of the Henry Parkes Foundation tonight, Emeritus Professor Peter Webber, the Deputy Chair of the Foundation, Cathy Gray, the Foundation Honorary Secretary, Emeritus Professor Judith Brett, who of course is delivering the oration tonight, Professor Mark Kenny, the 2020 Henry Parkes Orator from ANU's Australian Studies Institute, who will be moderating the question and answer session. We also have, I think, one or two previous orators, Professor AJ Brown and Professor Ian Chubb. I'm not sure if he's here or not. And also I'd like to acknowledge Professor Paul Pickering, Director of ANU's Australian Studies Institute, and Virginia Hausiger, journalist and media advisor and a great contributor to Moed. So Moed shares a common goal with the Henry Parkes Foundation. Both our organisations encourage Australians to examine our country's social and political past. We both believe in the critical importance of civic engagement, and we both acknowledge history as a lens through which to envision our future. The Foundation has been an incredibly generous patron of Moed for a number of years, and I'd like to thank them for their ongoing support. And as we all know, it was 1889 when Henry Parkes gave his now famous speech at the Tenterfield School of Arts. Parkes, who had arrived in Australia 3 decades earlier as an impoverished immigrant, urged the Australian colonies to federate into a single nation. His vision of a united Australia is something we are reminded of, having now lived through years of state border closures during the COVID-19 pandemic. Though on the whole Australia is now open, it is still impossible for thousands of school children around the country to participate in excursions to Canberra. Budget constraints, logistical complexities and sheer distance mean many schools will never be able to make it to Moed. However, thanks to the generosity of the Henry Parkes Foundation, Moed was able to establish a dedicated digital studio in 2020, allowing us to reach students in regional remote parts of Australia. Equipment purchased with the help from the Foundation means we can deliver vital education programs to even more young people and encourage participation in democracy from an early age. Thank you again. As we come to the close of another eventful year in Australian politics, we are reminded the conversation of democracy is ongoing. Back in May, Australians performed one of the most visible and most important democratic acts. We had our say in the future of the nation. Every citizen of Australia was given the opportunity to cast a vote in the federal election. But the Saturday in May is just one part of the longer story of Australia's democracy. We grew from a fledgling nation that granted voting rights only to the most privileged citizens to a country that now embraces compulsory voting. Shortly you will hear from Professor Brett on the history of democratic elections in Australia and how we got to where we are now. We are honoured to host her and all of our guests this evening for the 2022 Henry Parkes Oration. And I'd now like to pass over to Ian Thom. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been great working together with you, and that you mentioned that Henry Parkes Digital Studio. Its timing was absolutely perfect because the museum got that operating just before COVID broke. No one could come. Every student was effectively a remote student, but they could join now through that studio, and that's marvellous to have had. And we thank you and your team for organising this function for us today because, again, using the word remote, it was done by remote control from Sydney, so thank you so much for that. Auntie Vada, thank you. You're very passionate about your beliefs and what you've told us, and I think it's a very important subject and needs further discussion. It was really good to meet again, and on behalf of all of us present, I accept your welcome to country. It's a marvellous thing to be welcomed and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And just on a personal thing, I really would like to say how much I enjoyed your welcome to country at the National Day of Mourning up the hill at New Parliament House. That was really, really respectful and well done.
I have brought up the respect, my honours, and never speak ill of the dead.
Perfect. Now, I want to welcome all of you who are watching online. We're doing this through YouTube, and I'd particularly like to welcome our friends in the Tenterfield School of Arts who are watching. They have a theatre up there, and we're being projected onto the big screen. Our Henry Parkes orations are held alternately in Moab here, and the next year will be up in Tenterfield. So they all go well, and of course the timing is, the time today is 133 years since Henry gave his call for federation up at Tenterfield. I acknowledge the Parkes descendants who are here and those that are watching. A little about the Henry Parkes Foundation. We're a charitable trust, just a small group of advisors and trustees, and we're established in 1998, and our aim is promoting social justice, public engagement and understanding Australia's constitutional structure and political systems. And I believe that tonight's oration will certainly meet those objectives. And if you'd like to, you can check out the Henry Parkes Foundation website and you'll find our previous orators have all spoken on topics close to Henry's heart and the things that meant a lot to him. It's a simple address, just parkesfoundation.org.au. We're honoured to have our patron, Dame Mari Bashir. Dame Mari had the privilege of using Henry's office in the Colonial Secretary's building for 13 years in her term, and she became very passionate and really got to know the vibe of Henry being there. I also acknowledge the previous orators from 2017, Ian Chubb, our former Chief Scientist, 2019, Professor A.J. Brownsdown from Queensland, from Griffith University, and he's also with Transparency International. And our 2020 orator and political correspondent, Professor Mark Kenny. And Mark, as we mentioned, will run the Q&A for us here after the oration. We will be having roving mics, so if you would just, hold it till you get the mic so we can record the question, that would be much appreciated. Now, allow me to introduce our 2022 Henry Parkes orator, Emeritus Professor Judith Brett. As you can see from the program, that Judith has had a very busy career as a political scientist and at La Trobe Uni. And she's done quite a variety of articles and books. One of them was really about one of Henry's contemporaries, the enigmatic Mr. Deakin. And I encourage you to search out Judith's talk, Judith's Deakin oration on YouTube. I think you'll find it fascinating, actually quite brilliant. And among her other works have written on the Menzies Forgotten People, and more recently the book From Secret Ballot to Democracy Sausage, where Judith has researched and detailed the history of how and why our voting system came about to keep this Australian electoral system going. So in this world of political instability, where democracy is more important than ever, I invite Emeritus Professor Judith Brett to present the 20th Henry Parkes Oration, How Good Are Australian Elections? Thank you, Judith.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to all who are here, and thank you for inviting me. Henry Parkes was a radical Democrat, and so what I'm going to talk about tonight is Australia's achievement of radical democracy in the 19th and early 20th century Australia. We've just heard that this oration remembers and celebrates the famous address in 1889 to the citizens of Tenterfield, in which she rekindled the movement for federation of the Australian colonies. Politicians had been talking about it for at least a decade, but momentum was stalled, in no large part because New South Wales stood apart. At Tenterfield, Parkes brought the mother colony on board, and the next year, in 1890, a conference of leading politicians from each colony met in Melbourne and agreed to the way forward, and Deakin was at that. And he wrote a very memorable portrait of Parkes. It's not totally flattering, but it recognises the greatness of the man and his achievements. Speaking in the Tenterfield School of Arts, Parkes said, "The great question which we have to consider is whether the time has not now arisen for the creation on this Australian continent of an Australian government and an Australian parliament. Surely what the Americans have done by war, Australia can bring about by peace." I just want to repeat that. Surely what Americans have done by war, Australians can bring about by peace, which they did. Australia was born, one could argue, not on the battlefield, but in the ballot box, in the two referenda in the last years of the 19th century that accepted the federal constitution. 16 years later, in 1915 on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the nation was born again when the mettle of its men was tested by war. Now, the Anzac legend is a core Australian foundation myth. But what we need more than stories of blood and heroic sacrifice, compelling as these are, to understand our peace, we need more than this if we want to understand our peacetime nation and its achievements. So that's what I want to talk about tonight, the story of the development of Australia's electoral system. It's a story about confidence in the democratic majorities and about practical innovation to make sure that our elections capture the will of the majorities. So the first answer, my title, How Good Are Australian Elections? The first way I've been talking about it is to channel Scott Morrison, you know. How good is Australia? Thumbs up. So how good are Australian elections? And that's what I'm going to tell you about, the achievements. And then towards the end, or at the end, I'll raise some questions about areas for improvement. And that people might have other ideas that they'd like to bring up in the Q&A. So I'll begin with manhood suffrage and the secret ballot. When Parkes spoke at Tenterfield in 1889, these had been in place for almost 3 decades in Eastern Australia. As a young man in Birmingham in the 1830s, Parkes was a participant in the campaign for the reform of Britain's Parliament, which resulted in the 1832 Reform Act. This abolished the Rutten boroughs and gave some representation to the new industrial cities like Birmingham. But it delivered nothing to the propertyless working men like Parkes. Agitation for the reform of Parliament continued, carried by the Chartists, which was a working class political movement formed in 1838 The year before the impoverished Parkes, young Henry and his new wife Clorinda sailed to Australia as assisted migrants. Henry brought the Chartists' commitment to a democratic parliament with him, as did many other young men who were forced by poverty and lack of opportunity to leave Great Britain during the Hungry 40s. Their numbers were swelled in the 1850s after gold was discovered in Victoria, and many more young people, especially men, flocked to the goldfields to seek their fortunes. The Chartists had 6 demands: the vote for all men, secret ballots to prevent bribery and intimidation, which is why they wanted the secret ballots, the abolition of property qualifications for members of Parliament, payment for members of Parliament, which was necessary if working men were ever to be able to enter Parliament, and equal electoral districts and annual parliaments. The annual parliament one's never been achieved and probably wasn't a very good idea. But the others have been achieved and were good ideas. Now, the 1850s are crucial years for the establishment of Australia's electoral system. During this decade, all the colonies except for Western Australia were granted self-government, and constitutions were adopted which established 2-chamber parliaments. West Australia was still accepting convicts, and it was hence excluded from self-government. Which men would be able to vote and stand then for these new parliaments? The Chartists wanted no property qualifications at all, but the British Parliament was the final arbiter, and it was persuaded to set a relatively low property qualification. It couldn't quite come at abolishing property qualifications altogether. It was persuaded by a conservative ex-colonist called Robert Lowe, who used a conservative argument. He said that if the property qualification was set too high, this would advantage the rich ex-convicts, but it would disadvantage worthy new immigrants who'd yet to establish themselves and wouldn't be able to meet the property qualifications. So he persuaded the British government that the vote was given to all adult men who paid a minimum of £10 rent a year. Now, this was the same level as was set in Britain, but the colonial economies were very different from the British economy at that time, and they became even more different after gold was discovered and inflation took off and rents soared. So far more men were automatically enfranchised than the British Parliament had ever intended. In the first elections in New South Wales that were held after self-government, 63% of men in the state had the vote, and a whopping 95% in Sydney, where rents were high. In England at the same time, only 20% of adult men would qualified for the vote under that rental barrier. And the story was similar in Victoria. In the wake of the Eureka uprising, the vote was given to any man who had a mining licence, and these only cost £1 a year. So this was virtual manhood suffrage. South Australia simply included manhood suffrage in its new constitution. The 3 other states, though, were much slower. Tasmania, with its large population of ex-convicts, didn't grant manhood suffrage until 1900. Surprising fact, I found. Still, this was well ahead of Britain, which delayed until after World War I. Though I should mention in this story of democratic achievement, there's one major impediment which was that the franchises for the upper houses, the legislative councils, were nowhere near as democratic. They still had substantial property qualifications, and these stayed in place until well into the 20th century, and which led to often protracted conflicts between democratically elected lower houses and conservative upper houses which blocked progressive reforms. But tonight we're going to stick with the good story. So, to keep with the story of democratic progress, the Australian colonies also achieved early the second of the Chartists' demands, well ahead of Britain again, the secret ballot. After the 1932 Reform Bill, which enfranchised a lot of new people, the British landed ruling class fought back by insisting on open voting. Why did they want open voting? They wanted open voting so that the tenant farmer announcing his vote to the returning officer at a polling booth could be intimidated by the landowner's bailiffs. wavering electors were bribed with drink, and so it was in fact a public declaration of who you stood for. Not all Australian politicians supported a secret ballot, but the pressure was on. There was a problem though. How was it to be achieved, especially after the franchises had been extended and very large numbers of men were going to turn up at the polling booth to vote? If it was to happen in secret, at first they thought, well, they could all file into, there could be a room, they'd go to the returning officer would tick and say, yes, you're fine, and then they'd go into a room where they'd vote. This would take, they trialled this would take far too long. Secret voting was already established in some parts of the United States, where electors brought a piece of paper to the polling booth which had written down, was already filled in with the name of who they wanted to vote for. Political parties were already established in the United States, so it was easy. The political parties started preparing these ballots for the electors, so it was quite easy to see who people voted for, whether it was a red or a blue piece of paper, for example. So the challenge was a practical one. How was the secret ballot to actually be implemented? And it was achieved by a man called Henry Chapman, who the Victorian Parliament gave the task of finding a solution. He was a student of the radical thinker and parliamentary reformer Jeremy Bentham, and he took up Bentham's suggestion that the voters should arrive at the polling booth empty-handed. That is, not bring a bit of paper with the name of the preferred candidate written on it. The government would give them a ballot paper with the candidates' names listed, and all the voter would have to do was to complete the ballot paper and put it in the ballot box. In this first trials, they had to cross it out, the ones they didn't want, and they've got ink and blotting paper, and it took ages. So then there was the invention of putting little boxes next to the names, and you just had to put a cross next to the one you wanted. But there was still another practical problem, which was that sharp-eyed spies could watch the ballot paper being filled in. Perhaps they should go into the second room, I suggest, but this was going to take too long. And the solution was a room with 5 or 6 separate stalls where men could vote in private. Thus was invented what became known as the Australian ballot, and it spread throughout the world as more and more countries adopted the secret ballot and the wooden dividing panels. These have now been replaced with cardboard, but it's exactly the same design as was invented in Victoria and also in South Australia at about the same time they were introduced in the 1850s. So it's sometimes said that Australia invented the secret ballot, which is wrong. It didn't invent it, but it did invent the means to achieve it. Now, if I had Australia's next pioneering achievement was giving women the vote. This happened in South Australia in December 1894, and it was achieved through a spectacular own goal by the bill's Conservative opponents. The usual arguments were being put forward that women were too stupid to vote, or too emotional, or too unworldly, or politics was too nasty, and women were too pure to be messed up, involved in this nasty world. They didn't want the vote anyway. These had all failed, and the bill's Liberal supporters looked like the bill was going to be passed. The Conservatives decided to try a different tack, and they moved an amendment that women should also have the right to stand for Parliament. The women hadn't asked for this, and the Conservatives thought that it was so obviously ridiculous that it would lead to the bill being thrown out. How wrong they were. The supporters embraced the amendment, and South Australian women were granted not just the right to vote, but the right to stand for Parliament. The latter was a world first, though its first place in getting the women's vote. They were pipped at the post by New Zealand the year before. This meant that South Australian women were able to vote in the referenda on federation, and that's crucial to understanding the easy passage of women's suffrage in the new Commonwealth Parliament. Effectively what happened was there was a sort of an implicit guarantee to women, to the South Australian women, that women's suffrage would come with the new Parliament. If that hadn't been in place, the risk was that the South Australian women would vote against federation. And if one of the states voted, one of the colonies, I should say, voted against it, well, then federation wouldn't have happened. So the first federal parliament then was elected on the basis of the electoral laws of the various colonies, and these varied. As I said, women could vote in South Australia but not elsewhere. Aborigines could vote in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, but not in Western Australia or Queensland. The decision was made that the laws governing federal elections would be the same or uniform across all the states. And this is another important feature of our electoral system, which distinguishes it from the United States, where elections in federal political institutions, including the president, are conducted according to state laws, which vary a good deal from state to state. Here, for federal elections, we all vote according to the same laws, though for a long time there was quite substantial differences between the state laws. So the Commonwealth Franchise Act of 1902 would henceforth govern federal elections. This act established universal franchise for all men and women, but only if they were white. The bill, which the Liberal government of Edmund Barton and Alfred Deakin took to the Parliament, gave the vote to all natural-born or naturalised subjects of the King resident in Australia for 6 months or more. That is, it was a very liberal bill with no exclusions based on race. This was quickly pointed out that this would give the vote to coloured members of the British Empire living in Australia, for example, an Indian or a Jamaican. The leader of the government in the Senate, who was overseeing the passage of the bill, Richard O'Connor, responded that this was a very small number of men or of people, and that the Racially Restrictive Immigration Act would mean it didn't grow. He also pointed out that only in Western Australia and Queensland were coloured people and Aborigines prevented from voting. At that point they could vote in colonial elections. And that many were already on the electoral rolls, and that the right of these individuals to vote in federal elections was protected by the Constitution. O'Connor argued forcefully that Aborigines should not be excluded from the franchise. It was monstrous, he said, that Aboriginal men able to vote under colonial legislation would have to tell their sons, although your people owned this country for centuries before the white man came here, although you are his equal in intelligence, you shall not have the right to vote. Opposition to giving Aboriginal people the vote was vehement, especially from West Australian and Queensland senators and members of the lower house. And in the end, O'Connor didn't have the numbers to pass the bill, and he had to give in. The Aboriginal natives of Asia, Africa, Australia and the islands of the Pacific were excluded, except for the Maoris, who were allowed to vote. The disenfranchisement of Aborigines is one of the infamous stepping stones of cruelty and shame in our treatment of Indigenous Australians, which wasn't fully remedied until 1962, when all Aboriginal people got the right to vote. Now, universal franchise is the bedrock of a democratic electoral system. Everyone having the right to vote is a necessary condition of democracy, but is it sufficient? When and where do we vote? And who draws up the boundaries of the electorates? And should voting be compulsory? I began thinking hard about these details of our electoral system after my publisher, Michael Haywood of Text, suggested to me that I write a book on compulsory voting. Australia is one of only 19 countries 19 of the world's 166 democracies that make voting compulsory. None of Europe's large democracies do, and none of the countries we most often compare ourselves with. The United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, New Zealand or Ireland. I had this conversation with Michael shortly after Trump had defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election, and many Australians were reassuring ourselves that because of compulsory voting, such a man could never be elected here. So Michael asked himself, well, why has Australia got compulsory voting and how did we get it? He said he didn't know, and he thought that if he didn't know, Neither would most other Australians, and would I write a book about it? I wasn't convinced that there was a book in it, but I said I'd think about it, and I did some reading. And I came to the conclusion that not only was there a book in it, but more importantly, that compulsory voting was the culmination of a tradition of radical majoritarian democracy in Australia, which stretched back to the establishment of self-government in the 1850s and the invention of the Australian ballot. I also learned in doing the research just how distinctive Australia's achievements were in the administration of elections and how important this has been to how we vote. Elections demand organisation. Someone has to run them, and they need rules to go by. In the 19th century, in England, elections were run by local government officers who took on extra tasks at election time, and in the United States it was done by the political parties. In Australia, they came to be run by paid public servants. Now, I haven't got time to tell you the detail of this, it's in my book, but the colony of South Australia pioneered this when government officials took over the management of the electoral rolls. William Boothby, after whom the electorate of Boothby in South Australia is named, was South Australia's chief electoral officer for almost half a century, and he established the first permanent electoral organisation in the world. The new Commonwealth adopted Boothby's organisational model and created the Commonwealth Electoral Office to manage the federal role and run federal elections. In 1984, this became the Australian Electoral Commission. Now, not only does it manage elections, but it also determines electoral boundaries, a really crucial decision-making power, and it oversees regular redistributions as populations shift. So this stands in sharp contrast again to the way elections are conducted, particularly in the United States, where elected party officials in different states draw up electoral boundaries to their party's advantages, so they look like pieces of jigsaw puzzles sometimes, while you take in your supporters and exclude your opponents. And in some states, the electoral administration also indulges in really dreadful voter suppression to prevent supporters of their rival party from voting. Now, there's a couple of other unique features of the Australian electoral system, which I'll briefly mention that I discovered when I was doing the research for the book. Two, we owe to the early strength of the Labor Party. Something I didn't really fully realise until I did the research was that in many other countries, a voter has no choice about where to vote. You're registered to a particular polling booth and you turn up there to vote on voting day. You can make arrangements like postal voting or proxy voting if you know in advance you're not going to be there. But if, for example, you're planning to get the train home from work and the train breaks down and you don't make it back to that polling booth, you can't just pop out at lunchtime and vote in any other booth. Since 1902, though, Australians have been able to vote in any polling booth in their state. Labor pushed for this so that itinerant rural workers would be able to vote. The drovers, shearers and fruit pickers who would likely be away from home when an election was called and would also be more likely to vote Labor. So this was something that Labor got into the first Federal Franchise Act. The second distinctive feature we owe to Labor is that we vote on a Saturday. Saturday voting was first introduced in Queensland, as that was the day that the farmers came to town to shop. But after Labor won federal government in 1910, it introduced Saturday voting for federal elections. Saturday afternoon was a half holiday, so it made it much easier for working people to vote, and it was also easier for housewives because their husbands were home, could accompany them to the polling booth or could mind the children. So these two features, Saturday voting and the choice of polling booth, enabled the invention of the democracy sausage. Most polling booths, it wasn't their intention, but most polling booths are at community centres, schools, kindergartens, church halls, and over the years, volunteers have run food and drink stalls on election day to raise money. At the 2010 Queensland election, some Brisbane friends set up a website for groups to register their election day fundraising offerings to help people choose where to vote. That is, the democracy sausage completely depends on the fact that we have a choice of where we vote. So England won't be able to do it. or America or Ireland, where you've got to go, back to where you were born almost. In 2016, it was the Australian Word of the Year. So now we can get up on a Saturday morning thinking about breakfast and can go to the website, which will tell of the various offerings. Which ones are going to be selling sausages, where there's vegan options, where you can get coffee and muffins and so on. And it's added a festive element to our election day, and I think too an important hook into voting for the social media generation. It's an example of a sort of a flexibility in our voting system. There are two more distinctive elements of the way we vote that I want to mention: preferential voting, and last but not least, compulsory voting. Now, unlike the Australian ballot, which took the world by storm, and votes for women, and more recently an impartial body to administer elections, in neither preferential nor compulsory voting has Australia led the world. Though I'd argue that democracy would be much stronger in many countries if we had. Preferential voting was introduced in 1919 because of the pressure from farmers' groups who felt that their interests were insufficiently represented by the major non-Labor party then in government, the Nationalist Party, that it was basically run by men from the city. And the farmers were threatening to stand candidates against sitting government members in what would effectively be three-cornered contests. In the first-past-the-post system that was then in place, such three-cornered contests risked the seat falling to Labor. For example, if the farmers and the Nationalists won 30% each and Labor won 40%, Labor would win the seat, even though it hadn't won the majority of votes on our notion of majority of 50% plus one. Unlike the first-past-the-post, where the most preferred candidate wins, with preferential voting, victory goes to the one that's least disliked. So under threat, the Nationalist government introduced preferential voting, and Farmer Party candidates won 11 seats, and a year later the Country Party was formed. And in 1922 it won enough seats to deny the government an absolute majority. And the new Country Party then drove a very hard bargain to enter a coalition with the Nationalists, a bargain which still governs relations between the Liberals and the Nationals when they form a coalition government. I'm a great fan of preferential voting. It enables minor parties and independents to influence election outcomes through exchanging preferences for policy outcomes, as the DLP did with the Menzies government. More recently, it's enabled the Greens and independents to win seats, and the wave of teal independents owe their success to the determination of Australian farmers a century ago to form their own party. So it's given our electoral system, I think, the flexibility to accommodate minority interests and to respond creatively to the decline in support for our major parties of government. Compulsory voting followed soon after preferential voting in 1924. People had been arguing for it intermittently since the middle of the 19th century. The most common argument was that with compulsory voting, the government would be elected by the majority of voters, not just by the majority of those who turned up on the day, and that this would enhance the government's democratic legitimacy and make sure that politicians paid attention to the interests of all the people, not just their base. As I read through the various parliamentary debates, which went on from the middle of the 19th century, I was struck by the absence of philosophical objections, of appeals to freedom or liberty or rights. The arguments raised against it were mostly practical. It would be too hard to enforce. What level should the fine be set at? If it was too high, it would discourage people from enrolling to vote if they risked being fined for not voting, and such arguments. Labor had made it compulsory to be on the electoral roll in 1911, but it wouldn't take the next obvious step and make voting compulsory because this would require it to abandon its long-standing objection to postal voting. You couldn't make voting compulsory and not have postal voting. I'm going to have to have some water. Sweet. Labor was opposed to postal voting because it risked the secrecy of the ballot. Doctors might oversee the votes of their patients, squatters their workers, housewives their servants. And you couldn't, as I said, you couldn't make it compulsory without postal voting. But by 1924, Labor had given up on opposing postal voting and now supported it. Queensland had experimented with it during the war at a state election, and Labor had actually benefited. So that's one of the reasons Labor now thought it might actually help it. The other is that Labor was a pretty demoralised party by the early 1920s after the splits over conscription. The catalyst for its introduction was the federal election, a very low turnout at the federal election in 1922. Just short of 58% of people voted, a drop of 17% since the election in 1919. But in Queensland, 83% turned out. So this seemed to suggest that compulsory voting would actually have a big impact on the turnout. When a private member's bill was introduced in 1924, it went through both houses in a single day. Only one speaker made a sustained objection to compulsion as a matter of principle, a New South Wales Labor senator who'd been a fierce opponent of conscription. He argued that it was an infringement of the liberty of the individual, but as he was a Labor man, he would abide by party policy and vote with the caucus. So compulsory voting is the result of Australia's commitment to majoritarian democracy, as was its early adoption of manhood suffrage and votes for women, and its pioneering impartial electoral administration. It has four great advantages, I think. First, it fosters high turnouts. Australian turnouts are above 90% of registered voters. Election outcomes are thus more legitimate when we know that the government won support from the majority of registered voters, even though we're sometimes very disappointed with the outcome. Second, politicians can't afford to completely ignore the interests of particular groups. We know from voting studies that where voting is voluntary, it's the poorest, least well-educated, most marginal people who are least likely to vote. But with compulsory voting, policies that are pitched only at the comfortable are a big risk. Third, compulsory voting fosters political engagement. Young people turning 18 have to vote. When I was teaching, I taught first-year Australian politics for many years, and I'd go around the tutorials, ask people why they're doing the subject. The most common answer was, well, I'm turning 18, I'm going to have to vote. I thought I should find out something about how our politics works. And so they're forced to pay at least minimal attention to parties, to leaders and policies. And as well, as a nation in which we have an immigration nation, new immigrants, when they become citizens, also acquire the right, not just the right, but the obligation to vote. And so they too require the obligation to find out something about our electoral system and the choices that the parties are offering. The fourth and final advantage is that compulsory voting lowers the temperature of political debate and draws our politics away from the zealots of left and right towards the so-called sensible centre. Because parties don't have to get out the vote, they don't have to motivate people to go to the polling booths, they're less likely to campaign on highly emotive, divisive issues, especially those around sexuality and religion. So that's the statement part of the title, How Good Are Australian Elections? And the elaboration of my answer, which is that they're very good indeed. Now, to ask it as a more open-ended critical question, how could they be improved? What could be improved? Now, I don't here plan to consider issues to do with funding of campaigns and the regulations governing political advertising, but I want to keep the focus on voting. And I think there's one big flaw in the majoritarian basis of Australia's electoral system, which is the disproportionate weight that's given to Tasmania. The Constitution guarantees 5 electorates, irrespective of population, and now that's only relevant to Tasmania, whose federal electorates have considerably fewer voters than in the mainland, around 80,000 compared to 113,000 on the mainland. But it's in the Senate that Tasmania's overrepresentation is most egregious. 12 senators for a population of 571,000 compared with 2 senators for the ACT's population of 456,000. But short of a referendum to remove Tasmania's legal status as a state, which is not likely to happen, I don't think there's anything we can do about this. It's a flaw we're going to have to live with. The second, though, is easier to fix, and this is my last point, which is that permanent residents are unable to vote. The 1902 bill that was introduced by Richard O'Connor gave the right to vote on one ground only: residence in the Commonwealth of 6 months or over by any person of adult age. This liberal intention was compromised, as we've seen, by racial exclusiveness, but it is more generous in terms of residence than our current law, which bases the right to vote on citizenship. Permanent residents have no say in the laws which govern them, even though they may have lived here and paid taxes for years. It affects around 1.7 million people. There's another 1.7 million people on various forms of temporary visas, and some people argue that they too should be able to vote after a period of residency. I'm not quite so convinced about that one, but I am about the permanent residents, because in applying for permanent residency and achieving it, there's a commitment to make Australia a permanent home. New Zealand, for example, gives the right to vote to people after a year's continuous residence. This would be in keeping with the spirit of radical majoritarian democracy that was brought to Australia by men like Henry Parkes in the middle of the 19th century. And unlike the disproportionate representation of Tasmanians, it's something we could do something about. Thank you. Now we can have the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Judith. That was an extraordinary journey through a history, and in the right place to do it too, in Old Parliament House. A great journey through the history of Australia's electoral system and the role that Parkes played and others in those early days, in a number of decisions that were made. I'll just start off with a few questions for you, and then we'll perhaps take some questions. And as Ian, I think, said, it'd be great if you do have a question to perhaps at a opportune moment move to a microphone, and I can sort of see them under the lights a bit. Kathy is over by one of them at the moment. There's one on that side and one on the other side. That way, those people who are participating on this with this online and indeed listening to it later can actually hear the questions. And as we all know from the last election, the questions are very important, almost as important as the answers, according to some journalists, perhaps. Let me start, Judith. Thank you again for that extraordinary address. Really enjoyed it. You began with that observation, I think it was from Parkes, what Americans have done by war, Australia can do by peace. Was that Parkes who said that?
Yep.
Yeah. It's a really interesting observation, because it is kind of a critical difference between the story of America and the story of Australia. Some people have actually analysed that as a good thing, though it is, no doubt. We didn't have the suffering of a civil war and so forth, or a war of independence. But some people have made the point, it may even have been you that I read has made this point as well, that in a way we've kind of inherited a number of things, almost because it was easy, which does sort of fit that Australian narrative of that sort of laconic, simplest path, pragmatism in much of Australia's design. I wonder whether what you think about that, whether we've sort of we just sort of slid into democracy and it's turned out to be pretty good. And as you say, in a range of ways, we made it better. Sometimes accidentally and sometimes deliberately, because of the Chartists and others in that early process. But I wonder if you could just talk about the way in which we got it, that we developed these democratic traditions, and whether in some ways that's led to us being perhaps a little lazy about making subsequent changes, particularly the big one, of course, being to complete the project and become a republic?
Look, I don't think... Is this on? Yeah. I don't think it was as easy as all that. I mean, if you look at the achievement of votes for women, for example, that was the result of a long, fairly, fiercely fought campaign by women for quite a while. And although women got the vote in 1902 at the federal level, I mean, it was 1909 before they got it at Victoria. I mean, that campaign had to stay up. So there was a certain amount of conservatism still built into the system. And I think that what I didn't talk about, but there were a lot of struggles between the upper and lower houses where, you had these very conservative councils, particularly around the distribution of land, for example. I mean, they blocked giving votes for women for, decades. So I don't know that it's been that easy. I think the point that I was trying to make there is that if you look at our foundation myths, Anzac has just, and particularly since it was sort of reinvented by John Howard, just looms enormously large. And so somebody like Alfred Deakin, who I think is he's a really important historical figure, but a really interesting and amazing man in many ways, is not particularly well known. He's fallen out of popular memory. And when I was writing the book, I was thinking, well, why is it? Well, it's because the First World War comes straight afterwards. And so you then get a whole new batch of heroes, people like John Monash and Pompey Elliott. And there's a way in which those sort of heroic sacrifices capture the imagination in a way that that building democratic political institutions looks a bit tame.
Yeah, no, I accept that, but I suppose what I'm trying to get at is the absence of any sort of spirited rights debates that we have in Australia that sort of feature in American politics and in some other places.
Because we're not a rights... Yeah, I think that... I mean, that's an interesting point. But I think historically it's because Australia is founded in the 19th, not in the 18th century, and so we're not as worried about rights as the Americans are in our political culture. Australia's government's already here from the beginning. We didn't have to sort of create a government, and the government gives rights depend. We should have this again. I've got a discussion of this in the first part of the book. Basically, we don't have a sort of historically deep belief in natural rights. We see rights more as coming from the existence of a stable government, in the way the Americans have a sense of the individual and their natural rights in tension with government.
That's right. There's almost like sort of an antagonism toward government, hence the Second Amendment, which is premised on this idea that at some point you may need to be at war, at defending yourself physically against your own government.
They have a sort of social contract theory that you start with rights-bearing individuals who give over little bits of their rights to the government, and that's what creates the government's legitimacy, whereas we started with the Crown, which is already there and legitimate.
Yes, okay, so...
And it does explain to some extent why we're sort of stalled over the issue of the Republic, I think.
Yes, and potentially a similar thing that may occur in relation to what Aunty Violet talked about, the upcoming referendum on the Uluru agenda, that again we may find ourselves somewhat stalled, somewhat disinclined towards that next leap.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because I suppose what I'm saying is because of a sort of an almost like a truncated version of nationhood. We inherited a system. It's worked well. We have that if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of logic, which came through in the 1999 referendum. It's a pretty pervasive kind of Australian idea.
But the 1999 referendum was lost because John Howard was clever enough to split the Republicans. It wasn't... I mean, there were some people who voted no on the, if it ain't broke, don't fix it grounds, but there was a lot of them who voted no because they wanted to they didn't like the model. So I don't...
No, I certainly remember it and understand the
so
point.
I'm not so sure about... I mean, look, I think part of the problem is that, sovereignty never got to the people in Australia. It lands in Parliament, you know, and that's where it sits. And there's benefit, you know.
We have a question here, but
Yeah,
I'm going
anyway.
to, just quickly before we go to the question, I'll just sneak one final one in, because I wanted to just dwell on this issue of compulsory voting and what that's led to. You hinted at this when you talked about the way our system doesn't require the political parties to sort of tap into those emotive issues. I've described that in the past as the requirement in the US, for example, to make people angry in order to vote, which is not really a good basis, I think we'll all agree, for making any decisions.
Exactly.
But the system almost sort of drives it towards that. You have to really motivate people to get out there and vote, and they're going to do that when they're impassioned about something, usually in the negative side, you know, something that's about to be taken away from them. Our system doesn't do that. It's a really critical aspect, isn't it, of our system? And
Yes.
Nick mentioned who I think, I'm not sure if he still is, but he's been the chair of Museum of Australian Democracy. He in his time was a strong advocate of getting rid of compulsory
That's
voting.
right.
But really, it's not an issue that's had much purchase, is it?
No. I mean, when opinion polls are taken, there's generally somewhere between 60 and 70% of Australians say yes to compulsory voting, that they think it's a good thing. Some of them might object to it, but Minchin made a big effort to try to convince John Howard to do something about it. John Howard's on record as saying he doesn't support compulsory voting, but he said the majority of Australians do, so clearly Howard made the decision that he wasn't going to expend political capital on it. You know, so there is a sort of a libertarian wing, if you like, of the Liberal Party that is opposed to it. But on the whole, most Australians, I think, support it. And I actually think the democracy sausage has been a good thing, because I think it's given a sort of, I don't know, I mean, people, they smile when you talk about it. It's a slightly jokey thing, and it feels sort of comfortable somehow.
It's like this irreverent coda to the moment where you go in and you do your serious thing and you come out and you scoff a sausage.
And put yourself on social media.
That's right. And it was a really good point you made about the way it enables us to, a new generation, to sort of hook into, via social media and the like. Fascinating. I could talk to you all night, and I could certainly talk to you all night just about the differential between representation in the ACT and Tasmania.
It's a big,
or the differential in representation between Tasmania and New South Wales. If you think about, it operating in the different direction, 12 senators in Tasmania, 12 senators in New South Wales. The US, for example, only has 2 senators per state, which was perhaps a safer model, although we can see what their senators like as well. Let's take a question from over here. If you wouldn't mind, sir, saying your name when just ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. My name is John Lawrence, resident of Canberra. Not much else to disclose. Question though, wasn't there a podcast called Democracy Sausage that somebody may have had something to do with?
Judith's got a book called Democracy Sausage, or at least, from Secret Ballot to
Ballot.
Wasn't that the name of your podcast?
And I have a podcast called it. That's true. Thank you for the plug. I appreciate it.
So I wanted to ask a sort of a comparative question about putting New Zealand aside for a moment, because they're doing their own thing, and obviously the US is its own sort of dumpster fire. But looking at the UK and Canada, particularly as sort of a reference point, particularly in terms of like first past the post. And what made me think of this, there's an opinion poll out in the UK now from the last week, which has the Conservative vote on 19%, leading to a loss of every single seat they hold if an election was held now. And we've seen, similar sort of wipeouts like that have happened in Canada in the past as well. And I just sort of, wanted to pose the question, why do you think it is that particularly those two countries have not sort of followed the Australian example in terms of preferential voting particularly? Voting on a Saturday is also a pretty good idea. But also why they don't get around to electing their upper houses, which has always seemed like a good idea to me.
Look, I don't really think I can answer that. I mean, I don't know why why other countries don't adopt preferential voting. I guess, often political parties are nervous about changes and they think it might advantage the other one. Obviously in England they would think it would advantage the Liberal Democrats. But I can't really answer that question. I feel as if, certainly on the voting, the fact that you've got to go back to the polling booth where you registered, it seems to me that in that there's the ghost of property qualifications, that the initially voters were householders, and it's like the house that, you know, that becomes the basis from which your right to vote comes. Whereas that was abolished very early in Australia. So I'm sorry, I don't know whether Andrew's got views on this.
Well, look, I think there's probably a few things here about just the sort of reluctance of systems to change as well. You know, the sort of the kind of inertia in electoral systems, but also, as you say, touching on whoever's in power looks at the system and thinks, what do these changes mean for us? And if they can't see a clear advantage, they don't back it. So yeah, it's really fascinating. In keeping with our very balanced approach, I'm going to swing over to the left here now and take a question on this side.
It's quite tall.
A tall question.
So my name is Zalia Lai and I'm from Canberra. My question for you is, Australia is currently experiencing a trust deficit at a time where former politicians like Clive Palmer can buy an election. How do we restore trust in Australia's democracy?
Well, I think there needs to be work done on the donation laws, right, and on spending. But I'm not so convinced about the trust deficit. I think we've just had a really successful election. And I think that the election of the Teal candidates is really interesting for showing the way in which the electoral system provides a flexibility where the political parties have been not picking up shifts that have been taking place in a lot of popular views, and also there's been I think real question marks over the quality of some of our parliamentarians, and the electoral system has thrown up a new and different type of candidate in all these really articulate professional women. So I'm not, I think the election, I suppose what I think is that the election and the way and the parliament, this new sort of parliament that got created, the hope is that, I think that will restore trust, or will build trust. It won't restore it totally, because Australians have always been a bit cynical about politicians anyway, going back to the 19th century.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because Simon Holmes à Court makes the point in his book about the Big Teal, where he says that the candidates for those, the votes for those independents in a relatively small number of electorates vastly outweighed the votes that Clive Palmer's party was able to get across the entire nation after spending $80 million. And in a way, that's a vindication for community action rather than for a vulgar upchuck of money, which is what we saw from him. On this side, please.
Yes, I don't think I'm on the right. My name is Russell McGowan. I'm a citizen of Chapman in the ACT, but I was born and raised in Boothby, so thank you for raising both of those names in your address.
Me too. Born and raised in Boothby.
Indeed. I met Mark when he spoke at the oration. Now, you've outlined some strengths and weaknesses of our electoral system, and I acknowledge the strengths, but I want to focus on the weaknesses. One of them is the Senate. Unrepresentative swill, according to one of our Prime Ministers. How do we fix the Senate? And I'm wondering, by focusing on voting, you mentioned the Chartists having originally had the intention of having just an annual parliament. What period should our parliaments have, and is it the extending the Senate's terms to 8 years, 2 terms of the House of Representatives, that stops us from extending the term of Parliament, both in the lower and upper houses?
So 2 questions there about the Senate, and you're quite right, I didn't really talk about the Senate voting system. And again, it was very unstable. It changed quite a lot. During the 20th century, there was block voting for a while, and And, you know, what I find interesting is that it's still not quite right, but there is tinkering, there is attempts to, when problems emerge with the sort of preference whispering and things, to try to fix it. So there's a way in which, although yes, there's inertia built into it, Australians have shown themselves actually fairly willing to try and change things when they don't seem to be working well. Fixed terms, I have an open mind on that. I'm just not sure about whether
fixed terms, but an increase from 3-year terms, meaning 6 years
to 4 year.
Well, no, why 4? The UK normally has a 5-year term. France has 7-year terms for some of its officers.
Yes, I don't have a strong view on that.
I'm just putting it into the mix as maybe something which would change the argument about the way our Senate operates, for example.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated issue, and I think it could be the subject of a whole other book, frankly. Probably has been. I think we'll take, do we have one more question? We've got 2 more questions, have we? You, sir.
Oh, hello. My name's George Levantis. I also live in Canberra. My question is actually a little bit similar to Zali's about trust. But I was just thinking, after the 2020 US presidential election, obviously Donald Trump's rhetoric around electoral integrity and voter fraud and election fraud, it made me think, reading a statistic earlier this week, a really high number, something like 40% of American voters don't recognise Joe Biden as the legitimate president of the United States. I was thinking, what do you think are the kind of institutions in Australia and like the systems of Australia's voting systems that would protect Australia from ever kind of reaching a point where people have lost faith in the electoral systems? I was thinking compulsory voting sounds really good, but I wanted to know your thoughts. What really protects us from having a big distrust in the voting system?
Well, I think compulsory voting, but also the fact that our elections are administered by a non-partisan body, by the Australian Electoral Commission, and politicians. Like, for example, if we think about when a redistribution happens, populations shift. The Australian Electoral Commission says there's been a population shift here, we're going to redraw the boundaries, they put up a proposal. The politicians can make representations, the political parties can say we think it should be like this or that. They don't make the decision. The Australian Electoral Commission makes the decision. And I think that really protects it. The Australian Electoral Commission provides all the electoral officers. Regulations. For example, one of the things I thought people might ask about, which is convenience voting, the fact that we're all a lot of people now, we vote earlier. But it's the Australian Electoral Commission that makes the call on those things. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of trust in outcomes. They manage the counting of the votes, and it's really different. Whereas in America, you've got, I think Peter Brent said something. It's like you've got in each state, and even sometimes in counties within states, the laws are different. Things on prisoner voting or absentee voting and residential requirements and all these things. So I think it's the fact that the Australian Electoral Commission, but also that our electoral laws are uniform across the country. So I think that's another reason why there's a degree of trust. So I think we're pretty well protected from the sort of mess that we're seeing in the electoral system in the United States.
Yes, I think it's a very good point, particularly the last election in the United States, I think, was probably the most closely watched one in Australian history, partly because the technology allowed us to do it, but also because there was so much interest in whether Trump was going to get a second term. And I think all of us probably looked upon it and thought, this is utterly crazy, the patchwork of different officials, the involvement of local party bosses in the appointment of people, the politicisation of absolutely every office just leads to this corrosion of trust in the integrity of the process, and it basically tills the ground for the kind of thing that Trump was then able to say about it not being legitimate. Final question here.
Thanks, Mark. Great talk, Professor. My name's Steve, and you'll probably take this as a comment, but I'll try and squeeze a question mark in at the end.
Very kind.
I'm a big fan of compulsory voting. A good friend of mine, if my recollections are correct, worked at Federal Treasury for many years, and Ken Henry, who was the Secretary at the time, was giving a speech. Australia is at the forefront of econometric modelling and had 4-year forward estimates, etc., and is very good at looking at the impact of every policy and who will be affected, who won't be, etc., etc. And he put that all down to compulsory voting because politicians and the bureaucrats want to know exactly the effect across the whole population, because the whole population will get to vote. And I've mentioned it if other people didn't know it, and I was just wondering if you were aware of that. So that's my little question mark.
Yeah, I mean,
thank you.
I think that that argument for compulsory voting, which means that the politicians have to take consideration of everybody in the country, links to a more egalitarian policy. For example, I think that if we didn't have compulsory voting, we wouldn't have Medicare, because the Liberals were committed to dismantling it, but introduced as Medibank by Whitlam, dismantled by Fraser, reintroduced by Hawke, a certain sort of national health system. The Liberals were still committed to dismantling it, but once it had been bedded down, during that period, Australians have got used to it in that 13 years of Labor government. The Liberals couldn't risk it because it would have been electoral suicide. Without compulsory voting, I think they would have got rid of it.
It's a very good point. We'll end on that note, and with that I'll invite Ian Tom to the stage. And can I just say, Judith, thanks for that speech, that lecture. It was really brilliant, and I might just say, as I was preparing to come up here and ask you a few questions, a lecture is good when every time you're sort of jotting down a question, a couple of seconds later it's getting answered and you think, oh, I have to go with something else. So thank you very much. Very much enjoyed it.
Thank you, Mark and Judith, for those handling all those questions for us. And I'm sure everybody here has probably learnt something. There's a lot of information came through from your work, Judith, and that's really fascinating to get that early history, the links, the way it all ties together. And I tell you, there's one thing I'm sure of. I'm darn glad I live in Australia. Whoa, boy. So, Judith, I have some small little things here for you, if you'd like to come up. Just a little lucky dip, really. There's a 1996 coin that was put out, that's a silver proof one, when 100 years of Henry's death.
Oh.
And of course, a lot of people have forgotten. There's a lot of talk about the $5 note and who should go on the front of it. They've forgotten Henry was there 20 years ago. He bumped the Queen off when she was in office. This one is one for 200 years of his birth, and just a medallion we had struck. Our Henry Parkes orations, the ones, what are we up to, 2014 there, yes, right, that we've already done and bound off. They're all good there. And something strange, I thought I should try and get you something a little bit different. So I have a flag. Now, it's got a Federation star on it. So we know the importance. We've heard about how the electoral system works, and that represents so much of what has been said today. And Henry being the father of Federation, I thought, well, that's pretty good. But what's particularly interesting about this flag, it comes from the fourth or fifth generation now of a sailmaker who started in business here in 1880 in Balmain, not far from where Henry lived in Balmain. And they'd been, making sail and all that sort of thing. And now they've got into flags and other stuff. And the important thing is, the name of the company is E.H. Brett and Sons. I thought you'd like that. So just to conclude, thanking Andrew for hosting us here, Moad, the team. It's been good. Mark, thank you again for joining us and conducting our Q&A. As I said, things were done by remote, and of course, a lot of these things never happen, and we've been very lucky to have the assistance of our Honorary Secretary, Cathy Gray, to tie all the loose ends together for us. Makes my job very easy. I thank all of you attending and all of you viewing online. And now, looking at Henry's gold watch, I think it's time we go. And for you here staying, we have refreshments, but no sausage. Thank you.